welcome to the beginning of Unit 4. In this unit of second language acquisition, what I'm hoping to do for you is to introduce you, at least in a formal way, to the different methods that have been tried to teach languages in classrooms. And this is a huge topic. We've had a long history of trying out different methods. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break off this into pieces. And this very first piece, we're going to start at the beginning. And in the next step that we take, we're going to take a look at some pivotal ideas that came out in the late 70s and into the 80s. And then finally, where we end up, we're going to take a look at some of the most recent ideas that have come out about language teaching. And so what we're going to take a look at is we're going to cover the method of grammar translation, the series method, audiolingualism, and suggestopedia. So we're going to begin here. You'll notice that several of these have different names written down for the same method. So in our field, perhaps we're more guilty of this than in other fields, but in our field we tend to use different names for the same thing. And I don't want you to get caught up thinking that you aren't familiar with something that you really are familiar with. So grammar translation is often sometimes called GT. You'll see it abbreviated as GT, or called the classical method. That's less frequent. The series method is also sometimes called the direct method or the Berlitz method. Audiolingualism is often abbreviated as ALM or called the Army method. And then suggestopedia. So especially for these first 4 steps, the way I see it, in our field of teaching languages to others, I think that an important thing for us to keep in mind is who did we think we were teaching? Who did we think was able to learn language? Who needed to learn language? So in other words, who did we think our student was or they should be more like? And so I think if we think about who and what role languages were being taught for, that will help us start to have a sense of how the story flows. And this really is a story. I'm going to walk you through this in a historical way, and hopefully you'll make some connections in that way, and you'll be able to hold on to this. And later, when you take a look, when you see these methods in action in the videos that I've chosen for you, you'll kind of have a way to anchor it in terms of history. So, the place that we begin this story is actually with the very first language that was taught to others, and that was Latin. So Latin was the first language. It was taught at universities, and Latin, by the time it was taught in universities, was already a dead language. And what that meant was no one even knew how to pronounce the correct way to pronounce Latin at that point. They could only guess. So why did Latin matter? Latin was thought of as an extremely intellectual and important, significant language because many important texts had been written in it. It was also connected with universities. It was connected with intellectual engagement. Who could be found at universities in medieval times? Only the most elite. And almost always this was exclusively men. So we had men from the best families who'd been well educated at a time when most of the populace couldn't read. And so it was thought that these people were able to engage in the most difficult of intellectual tasks, and the more difficult the task, the better. And so the way that Latin was taught was called the classical method. And so the importance of learning Latin was so that you could read the texts that had been written in Latin. No one knew how to pronounce it, so you didn't listen to Latin in class. Your teacher would speak your first language. So if you were a native speaker of English and you were taking a Latin class, almost the entire class would be conducted in English. And what would you do in class? Well, because you were the best of the elite at the university, you were able to engage in great intellectual tasks, it was thought. You were given tasks to carry out that were pretty difficult. And these were memorizing huge vocabulary lists and memorizing grammar rules, and then excruciatingly carrying out the translation of sentences that applied this grammar rule. So if you were to walk into one of those early classrooms using the classical method, if you were to walk in unannounced, what might you see? You might see the teacher who shares the same first language as the students lecturing about a grammar rule and then assigning the students pages of sentences to translate that use this grammar rule. You might see the instructor assigning huge amounts of vocabulary to memorize the meanings of as homework. You would also see the advanced students begin to move from translating sentences to translating entire texts. You wouldn't see anyone listening or speaking in the language. You would see mostly reading in the language, and any writing that you saw would not be creation by the students. It would simply be translating word for word what the texts that were being translated said. So with the classical method, you saw the first language of the students used almost exclusively. Students would have no idea what the language they were learning, what it sounded like. Large amounts of memorization, lots of vocabulary lists, big focus on grammar rules, lots of sentence translation, and the entire method is grounded in what's called a structural approach to language. What does this mean? A structural approach means that the way that you see language is made of small pieces, like building blocks, Lego pieces, and that you have these pieces, you put them together like the way that Lego blocks interlock, and that's what language is. So if you have a structural approach to language, what do you think those pieces are? I bet you can guess from what we've talked already about the classical method. They would be vocabulary and grammar. So this was a view of language that was pretty limited. And it was believed that if a student had enough vocabulary, if a student had enough grammar, then what they have is the language that they need. So there was no room for any other pieces. That now that we've talked about some other elements in second language acquisition, probably you're already feeling like there's a little bit more going on with language than just vocabulary and grammar. So we started this story with the teaching of Latin. Now it makes sense given what the instructors were trying to do for those students. It makes sense that what they would be looking for is a focus on translating texts, a focus on reading, and that no one would learn to listen or speak in the language because Latin was dead already, and there were no native speakers of Latin left. Now, where the story gets interesting is where the classical method was used to extend to the other languages that began to be taught. So now we have French that's being taught in universities. Now, French is still a living, breathing language. We know how it sounds, or at least we can find out how it sounds from people who are native speakers or native-like speakers. German, for example, we can find out what it sounds like. So it's still a living language. So what you have is you have a story of a method used to teach a dead language. applied to languages that were still alive. So when I think about what came to be called, let's see if I can get this on right. Here we go. This is my scholar's cap. I'm at a university. And I know we associate this cap with graduation, but traditionally, especially in the Middle Ages, this would have been something that if you were a student, you would have worn every day to class. This was your uniform. So when we think about the classical methods move into what we know it as grammar translation, the key thing is to remember it's grounded in the teaching of a dead language. And what we've done is we've taken those methods that were useful for teaching a dead language and applied them instead to living, breathing languages. So what would this mean for a class in French? Well, the same thing. It would mean that you would have a focus on vocabulary lists, memorization of huge amounts. You would have a focus on learning the grammar, and all the lectures about grammar would be in the student's first language, not in French. The students would be hard at work translating sentences that used the new vocabulary and the new grammar rules that they were learning. And with the more advanced students, you would see them reading and translating longer texts. Would they be listening or speaking in the language? No, not with grammar translation. With grammar translation, the focus is almost exclusively on reading, and the only focus on writing is simply the translation of text. And that is the story of grammar translation. Now, even though grammar translation, grounded in the classical method, dates back to the Middle Ages, it's still living and breathing today. It's still alive. So if you were to travel around the world, it is very likely that you could walk in to a class, a language class, using grammar translation. So even though it's grounded in the past, it is not a thing of the past. There are many teachers who are still teaching in this method. But I hope that you can automatically see that we have a problem applying a method for teaching a dead language to living languages. So where does the story go? So we start out with a scholar. Where does the story go? Well, the story actually goes next to someone who very much believed in the power of grammar translation to teach. He was a teacher in France, and he was probably teaching Latin, but I'm not sure what the language was he was teaching. And he decided that he wanted to learn German. And so what he did was he arranged to go to Germany for a summer. And he said goodbye to his family in France before he left. And he said goodbye to his sister and his sister's little boy, his nephew. And the little boy wasn't speaking in French yet. He was completely silent. And so he hugged him goodbye and set off to Germany. So in his first weeks in Germany, what he did was he applied what he used with his students. He applied the grammar translation method. And he, in the first few weeks, memorized, wait for it, 245 key verbs in German. And he spent 2 weeks memorizing in the apartment that he'd taken. And after that 2 weeks, with his new knowledge of these 245 German verbs, he left the apartment and he went to the nearest university, sat in the back of the auditorium, ready to absorb knowledge in German. And he understood.